Can you explain a little bit that 15 square mile property in Arizona that was bought by the Saudis and what exactly they are doing there?
Yeah, so you kind of asked me like how I took it from going from the Smithfield Foods purchase by China, and after that, I mentioned there was this gentleman Daniel Slane, a former CIA officer, who said, "Look, the intelligence community is looking at this stuff. You should go chat with them." So I did, and I realized how much broader it was than just one country. And so I began asking what other countries are running low on enough water to grow enough food to meet their populations. And one of the wealthy countries that came up was Saudi Arabia. And so I thought, okay, so where's Saudi Arabia buying? And not surprisingly, they were buying across Africa. But surprisingly, at least to me, I found that they were also buying land in the middle of the Arizona desert, like Wile E. Coyote, saguaro cactuses, Arizona desert. And the reason is because there are ancient aquifers under there, left over from millennia past, with large amounts of water. This is non-renewing water. They call them fossil aquifers because once you use them, they're gone. And so they bought about 15 square miles and began tapping into those aquifers, pumping out huge amounts of water, to grow hay in the Arizona desert, and then ship that to Long Beach, where it gets packed on shipping containers and sent back to Saudi Arabia, to Riyadh. And fundamentally, and this is a key thing just to understand on a basic level, it's that 70 to 80% of the water that we use as humans goes to growing food.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the major use for water. And so when you say a country is short on water, you're also basically saying it's short oftentimes on food. And so you can't actually fill up shipping containers or oil vessels, with water. And it's not economical. You couldn't move enough water to meet a country's needs. So what you do is you go somewhere else and you use that place's water to grow food in that place, and then you ship the food, and economists will refer to this as virtual water. So the
Hmm.
food becomes an encapsulation of the water. So if you are water short, like a desert country like Saudi Arabia is, what you really need to do is go to another place to tap their water to use it to grow your food, and ship back the food as an encapsulation of water. And the most water intensive food products, of course, are meat products. And so the higher up the food chain you're shipping back, like China, when they're shipping back pork, you're shipping back a lot of water.
In the form of
And so
pork.
that's
Yep, I
how,
get it. Yeah, that makes total sense.
yeah. And so when I broke this story in 2015 about a Saudi company going into the desert and growing hay, what happens is the local impact is that the communities who have moved out there, and are relying on that old aquifer for their domestic wells, for their ranches, for their farming, or oftentimes just for their retirement homes. It's a lot of retirees out there. That water's just dropping every year, and eventually it's going to disappear. And in not that short of a period, but it also gets, the deeper it gets really expensive to drill that deep or to pull the water up, because just if you imagine hauling a gallon of water up 1,500 feet, it's a lot of effort and it requires a lot of electricity, and it's quite expensive. So the locals are really in an existential crisis out there. How long are they going to be able to continue to stay out there, as the water is pulled up and out of these aquifers?
Is there any level of oversight or regulation, or because the Saudi organization owns that property, they can do with it what they want, regardless of the impact to the local community?
Yeah, under Arizona law in this particular region of the state, there are no regulations on how much water they pump. They
Awesome.
bought the
That sounds
land.
great.
Yeah, right. They bought the land. They can put in the wells, and they can pump as much as they want.
Different but similar question to the purchase of Smithfield. Foreign entities looking at buying properties like this for this utilization, is there any level of screening that they have to go through? Any level of this idea being taken apart or regulated, or it's just money that passes hands?
It's just money that passes hands in the U.S. economy. If an American company were to try to go do that in other countries, Saudi Arabia, for instance, it won't pass. Saudi Arabia is very restrictive on how much water you can pump, and near has at one point, I think, basically, um, outright stopped using water for hay, and now it's very restrictive, very minimally using water to grow hay. That's true in many of these countries that are running into water issues. In Arizona, the Western United States is running into water issues, but there is currently nothing in place that prevents companies from coming in to do this. And in part, the U.S. has no national water policy. You look at countries like Israel that went from having water deficits, they instituted a national water policy, and now they actually have a water surplus, which they use geopolitically. I think they give water to Jordan, making sure that their neighboring country, I think that's the largest border they have, has enough water to helping it remain stable. So the idea of a national water policy, you've seen it put in place effectively, but the U.S. doesn't have anything like that. And so it's left to the states or the regions. And states like Arizona have water restrictions around, immediately around like the Phoenix area, because overpumping aquifers leads to something called also subsidence, where the land literally starts sinking under your feet. And it can lead to homes cracking, buildings tilting, just really damaging to large infrastructure projects, roads, bridges, canals. And so those regulations have been in place since the 80s, but out in the countryside of Arizona, it's basically a free for all.
Wild West, if you will, literally and metaphorically, I guess.
Yep.
So
Yep.
I would roughly, the way it makes sense to me to think about it is, for a lot of these countries, they're looking at it as a spoke and hub model. They realize a country, China, for example, or Saudi Arabia, they're recognizing their shortfalls, so they're putting these spokes out there all over the world to bring things back to the hub, utilizing the other countries' resources. How is the United States playing in this? I can't imagine that the U.S. is not at least externally looking at this as well.
Well, certainly Wall Street is. There has been a real big movement of large money moving into investing in farmland, both within the U.S. and outside the U.S. So that's certainly happening. And the State Department, the Department of Defense, others are looking at it, and the intelligence community is certainly advising Congress on it. But right now, I think Cindy McCain is now the head of the World Food Program. I think before that, it was David Beasley, the former Republican governor from South Carolina. And as David Beasley said, if we're not funding these world food programs, we're just letting future conflict grow. And I think Cindy McCain is going to Congress right now and trying to get increasing funding, maybe even just what they had in previous years funding, and it's really tough. So there is certainly a recognition within the U.S. government of this issue, but how much action is going to take place, I think, is still kind of a TBD.
Yeah, it seems as if other countries, if they are going to, again, use my term, the spoke and hub, if they're the hub and they're using the U.S. for some of their spoke locations and pulling resources out of the United States to ensure their food scarcity issues are at least in check, at some point the U.S. might have to start doing the same thing if they aren't already. And I'm just curious how far that would go before the U.S. either put some regulatory effort into this or started doing exactly the same thing to other countries.
Yeah, and the U.S. is, in this case, the U.S. is in a very favorable position because right now we do have we're a fairly water wealthy nation. We're a fairly land wealthy nation. Iowa probably is the best soil in the world. Ukraine, notably, is probably the second. And I think a lot of people, including my reporting, indicates that it was a large driver of Russia's interest in Ukraine. But there are also big issues. I know you had a guest on from, I believe, the Land Institute recently who talked about
Regenerative farming.